A mammoth vessel. So how does it just disappear?
So there are no bodies, there's no wreckage, they simply vanish off the face of the earth.
How is it possible that two crews seem to dematerialize?
What forces lie in these waters? Could it be something otherworldly?
One of the US's most prominent families is publicly plagued with tragedy.
Illnesses, accidents and murders. How could so much happen to one of America's most powerful families?
People were thinking that the Kennedy family must be cursed.
Both of them end up dying in this crash.
Is the curse enduring? And if so, can it be stopped?
A pub chair becomes a cursed seat, condemning unexpected patrons to a grim fate.
There are accounts of cyclists and motorists leaving the pub and having a fatal accident.
A local vicar declares that this chair is in fact evil.
Why would anybody curse a chair?
March 4th, 1918, the USS Cyclops, a colossal transport vessel, is docked in the port of Bridgetown, Barbados. The crew hurries to restock the ship, already filled to the brim with 10,000 tons of manganese ore cargo, before its long journey up the Atlantic to the Baltimore steel yards. When Captain George Worley and his 300 men depart, they radio out a short update. No one yet knows that this will be the final sign from the USS Cyclops, and as it grows small on the distant horizon, those standing on the Barbadian shore unwittingly become the last witnesses to the ship's very existence. For Captain Worley, his crew and his ship mysteriously vanish without a trace.
After months of searching, not one fragment from this colossal vessel has been found.
How could a mammoth ship carrying some 300 people simply vanish into thin air?
The disappearance of the USS Cyclops goes down in US naval history as the most sinister calamity outside of combat, and becomes one of many tales tied to the eerie maritime legend of the Bermuda Triangle.
The triangle is situated in the Atlantic and stretches roughly from Bermuda to the southeastern coast of the United States and the Greater Antilles Islands.
Often referred to as the Devil's Triangle or a twilight zone, the Bermuda Triangle is perhaps planet Earth's most infamous enigma. One need not look further than the hundreds of shipwrecks that speckle these waters as a telltale sign of the region's treacherous conditions.
This part of the Atlantic presents some environmental challenges like shallow reefs, magnetic variations, and an ocean gyre formed by 4 separate currents. The deepest part here, the Milwaukee depth, stretches down 27,000 feet.
However, perhaps the most concerning is the fact that at least 50 vessels and 20 aircraft have entirely disappeared within its blighted borders.
So there are no bodies, there's no wreckage, there's no oil slick, there's no Mayday signal beforehand, nothing. They simply vanish off the face of the earth.
What forces lie in these waters? Could it be something otherworldly?
Venturing into the bounds of this bizarre triangle is a gamble for anyone. For centuries, explorers have daringly crossed its threshold, documented their eerie encounters, and tried to make sense of this seemingly hexed hotspot. And only some have lived to tell the tale. The mystical reputation of the Bermuda Triangle can be traced as far back as the 15th century, when Italian explorer Christopher Columbus embarked on a westward expedition across the Atlantic. Little did he know, he would encounter a region that defies all seafaring logic known to sailors.
Now, Christopher Columbus, of course, is the Genoese merchant who was hired by the Spanish king in order to try and find a more direct route to the spice trade. And this took him westward, and what's so interesting is that he kept a rich diary.
Columbus is standing on the deck of his ship, the Santa Maria, drifting through the vast ocean waters. A quiet panic permeates the ship after days of frightening occurrences at sea. Columbus and his crew had witnessed a myriad of strange events that they believe could prophesy doom. A bolt of fire fell from the sky and crashed into the sea. The ship's compass erratically led them off course, and a thick raft of floating weeds had tangled their ship in calm waters. Columbus now scans the horizon for any signs of land, but all he sees is darkness. Then, a flickering glow in the distance catches his gaze.
Columbus writes that he sees this distant light glittering off and on, but it's too far away for him to make out exactly what it is. But some of his fellow crew actually see it too, disappearing and reappearing on the distant shore.
Columbus's strange journal entries detailing his encounter puzzle both seagoers and researchers who follow in his wake.
Well, we do know through study of his diary that at least one element of his story is a natural part of the environment of the triangle, and this is the Sargasso Sea.
It's a very large area of essentially seaweed. And it's also in an area that we call the doldrums. Doldrum means no wind.
Their ships were powered by sail, and they suddenly find themselves in this area of the sea which is very calm, and they're stuck in the middle of this very dense vegetation.
Known as a lost ship's graveyard, numerous boats have succumbed to the perilous Sargasso Sea. The windless conditions and sheet of thick algae in this desolate pool is said to have the power to ensnare vessels for an eternity. It's a place where one's means of propulsion ceases to exist, and according to nautical folklore, apparently so too does human life. In December 1880, a passenger ship named the Ellen Austin carries European immigrants from Liverpool to New York. As the story goes, the captain diverts south in the Atlantic for a calmer route against the westerly winds and soon sails upon an unexpected sight, another vessel, drifting aimlessly at sea, with no sign of crew nor passengers on board.
The captain is concerned about pirates and takes his time and circles the ship for a couple of days before he sends out a small crew to investigate.
A salvage team carefully climbs the ship and discovers a pristine interior carrying a valuable cargo of wood. But not a single soul is on board.
There was no sign of distress, and their personal belongings were intact. So where did all the people go?
Looking to seize the cargo on this empty ship, the captain orders his crew to sail the ship back to New York alongside the Ellen Austin.
But sailing north, the ships soon enter the clutches of a wicked storm that splits their conjoined path in two. When the sky finally clears, the captain of the Ellen Austin spots the other craft drifting in the distance. And when he finally nears close enough to board, his crew is strangely nowhere to be found.
How is it possible that two crews seem to dematerialize in what is otherwise an operationally sound craft?
While the legend of the Ellen Austin is not one entirely based in evidence, hundreds of other phantom ships have been discovered and mapped in the cryptic confines of the Bermuda Triangle.
Early maritime folklore would have us believe that this could be sea monsters or evil seaweed devouring the entire crew. Today, some of the popular theories are alien abduction or perhaps interdimensional wormholes that transport beings out of the Bermuda Triangle into a different realm.
Some renditions of the Ellen Austen tale claimed the captain quickly abandons the accursed vessel behind. Others, however, say he sends yet another crew aboard in a second attempt to salvage its hull. But soon, a dense fog rolls in atop the waves, and when it dissipates, not only has his crew yet again vanished, but the entire craft has as well.
This phantom ghost ship joins dozens of others that have sailed out into the ether.
On March the 13th, 1918, the USS Cyclops, piloted by Captain Worley and his crew of over 300 mariners, fails to make its scheduled arrival at the Baltimore Steel Yards, with nothing more than its final transmission in Morse code. Weather fair, all is well. The Navy initiates a massive search party, scanning the 800 nautical mile route for any clue of its whereabouts.
The search party really come up with nothing. They can't point to any storm that could have been responsible for the disappearance of the Cyclops.
This was a mammoth vessel. It was as long as 1.5 football pitches. So how does it just disappear?
After 2 months of scanning the depths and the surface of the sea, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the then Assistant Secretary of the US Navy, declares the Cyclops lost and all of its crew deceased at sea.
A magazine called Literary Digest published the theory that perhaps a ginormous octopus had risen out of the depths and grabbed this ship in its tentacles and hauled it down.
There is a theory about the disappearance of the Cyclops that relates to what was happening at the time, and that was the First World War. Worley, who was the captain of the Cyclops, was actually German-born, and the theory, fair or not, that was put out about the captain was that he had betrayed his new country. He had handed over the ship to the Germans, to his homeland.
George Worley was known to be a hot-tempered, tyrannical captain who cared much more about punishment than he did sound management of a ship. It was discovered that one of the engine cylinders was cracked prior to the voyage, and that the ship was carrying a weight that far exceeded what it could safely carry.
Some theorize that the damaged, overladen ship could have succumbed to the destructive force of a rogue wave.
A rogue wave is defined as an unexpected surge that creates a wave twice as large as those around it.
The ship is carrying a different cargo than it's built for. It's built to carry coal, but it's carrying magnesium, which is heavier and shifts in a different way. If the USS Cyclops was hit, dumped that load all the way to one side of the ship, and that ship would have just went right over and down, and it would have been quick. And of course, if it went into this trench, we are never going to be able to find it.
Adding to this peculiar story are the tragic fates of the USS Cyclops' sister ships that later go missing under eerily similar circumstances. In 1941, the USS Proteus is carrying 58 crew north from the Caribbean, when it too disappears in the Triangle's domain. 1 month later, the USS Nereus attempts the same route, but its crew of 61 never arrive at their intended destination, presumed dead and never recovered from the mystifying depths of the sea.
The mystery of the Bermuda Triangle doesn't end in the sea. Rogue waves and storms don't explain those crafts that go missing in the sky.
December 5th, 1945. U.S. Aviation Commander Lieutenant Charles Taylor radios control to request navigational support. It's been 2 hours since he and his 13 fellow aviators took off in a group of TBM Avenger bombers on Flight 19, a training mission over the Atlantic.
Flight 19 was a squadron of 5 torpedo bombers that took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on a routine practice mission. Lieutenant Taylor was meant to lead his students 141 miles out to sea on this practice bombing run before returning back to base.
What happened on this flight, though, was anything but ordinary. On their way back, something happened that made them disoriented. And the communications between Lieutenant Taylor was the first that showed signs that there was something very wrong on this mission.
I'm sure now that neither one of my compasses are working. We have just passed over a small island. We have no other land in sight. As the afternoon sun slowly descends, Taylor circles the skies above the open water, desperately searching for a landmark to set his squadron back on course.
Lieutenant Taylor describes that his compass has failed, much like Columbus did centuries prior.
Now, there is a scientific explanation for this, and that is that the Bermuda Triangle is one of only 2 places on Earth where a compass points to true north as opposed to magnetic north.
The difference between the two is called declination or compass variation, and trained navigators know how to compensate for this. Why wouldn't Taylor, an experienced pilot, not account for this compass variation?
The airbase operator suggests another pilot with a working compass take over the navigational lead. But already disoriented, the aviators harrowingly prepare for the worst possible outcome. Planes fly close formation. When first man gets down to 10 gallons of gas, we will all land in the water together. Does everyone understand that? Land units scramble to assist, dispatching 2 PBM Mariner aircraft to locate the squadron before their fuel tanks hit empty. But after 5 chaotic hours, suspended above the endless ocean, the final transmissions are received from Flight 19. We can't find west. Everything is wrong. We can't be sure of any direction. Everything looks strange, even the ocean. It looks like we are entering white water. We are completely lost. What course are we on now? Foxterre 3! Foxterre 3! The PBM Mariner crafts continue to scour the air, racing against the increasingly turbulent weather.
Less than 30 minutes into the search, they too fade off the radar and all communication is lost. This brings the total number of lives lost to 27.
In the ensuing days, the Navy expands their search, with hundreds of vessels and aircraft combing the nearly 500,000 square kilometers for any sign of the missing planes.
There was no debris, there was no record of any bodies or what happened to them in the end.
We're still asking that question. Where is Flight 19?
The disastrous tale of Flight 19 captivates America, and in the years following, several other aircraft follow it into the unknown, bolstering claims of a cursed corner of the Atlantic.
In the 1970s, a science fiction writer named Charles Berlitz wrote a book suggesting that perhaps these accidents and disappearances could be accounted for because there was something under the water. But it wasn't one living creature like a monster, it was an entire civilization that had sunk below the waves.
The lost city of Atlantis was a fabled utopian city first invented by the Greek philosopher Plato.
This fantastical theory, rooted in the earliest accounts of science fiction, is likely too far-fetched for most to fathom. Yet its eerie significance persists.
So one of the things that comes out of the Bermuda Triangle is that these stories are being passed around. And what's happening is that it adds to our minds a continuous chain of events. As it builds up over time, now it becomes more powerful, more mystical in nature, and then people are looking for the next one. And so anything that fits that narrative gets added to the chain. The longer the chain, the stronger the chain.
With so many questions left unanswered, this maritime legend lives on. Year after year, explanations are proposed, but none have definitively proven the cause for the region's anomalies.
Perhaps one day the truth surrounding the strange occurrences in the Bermuda Triangle will be revealed. But until then, the secrets remain buried in its depths.
It's November 1963, and families across America are transfixed to the breaking news story illuminating their television screens. President John F. Kennedy has been assassinated, ruthlessly shot while riding in an open-air motorcade through Dallas, Texas. For the citizens of the United States, this event will define a profound, unprecedented moment of collective grief. Their worlds forever changed by the deafening shot of a gun. But for the Kennedy clan, it's yet another tragedy tacked on to decades of perpetual misfortune.
JFK wasn't the first Kennedy to meet a grim fate. He wasn't even the second or the third. This was a family well acquainted with catastrophe.
Illnesses, accidents, and murders. How could so much happen to one of America's most powerful families?
In the aftermath of the president's death, JFK's grieving family comes to a chilling realization. It seems that a malevolent force has befallen the Kennedy name.
People were thinking that the Kennedy family must be cursed.
What are the origins of this burden? Is the curse enduring? And if so, can it be stopped?
The roots of one of America's most prominent names can be traced overseas to Ireland, where the first Kennedy relatives emigrated from in the 1840s, rooting themselves in the eastern state of Massachusetts. The family slowly grew its influence in politics and commerce. But it wasn't until the early 20th century, with the rise of Joseph P. Kennedy, that a dynasty was truly born.
He proved himself very successful and became the youngest bank president in the United States.
However, beneath the veneer of success hides a darker legacy. Joe was allegedly involved in bootlegging liquor during Prohibition and made a fortune through what today would be considered insider trading.
When Joe Kennedy Sr. married Rose Fitzgerald, they were achieving a union of two of the most powerful and important Catholic families in the northern United States.
Epitomizing the American dream, Joseph and Rose raised 9 children, including future President JFK, each of whom are expected to bring forth the determined Kennedy spirit as members of one of New England's most influential families.
They were charming, good-looking, generous, interested in politics, and they knew how to work with people.
The celebrated political accolades of the Kennedy clan, however, have shaky beginnings.
In 1937, President Roosevelt makes Joseph Kennedy the US ambassador to the United Kingdom. While on the cusp of World War II, Kennedy gained a reputation of being untrustworthy, someone who was prepared to pursue Hitler. Before he knew it, his political career was over, leaving him to channel his aspirations into his children.
He passes much of his political charisma onto his firstborn son, Joseph, of the family's plans for success. Against his father's wishes, Joe drops out of Harvard University in 1940 to enlist in the Navy Air Corps, flying planes under British command. But just before Joe was set to return home in 1944, he volunteers for one final top-secret mission, known as Operation Aphrodite. Joe Jr. co-pilots the very first flight, but as he lumbers the plane high into the sky, disaster strikes. While arming his payload, the bomb prematurely ruptures mid-air, instantly killing the eldest Kennedy before he has a chance to escape.
Joe Jr.'s death was a tragedy for the family, especially his sister, Kathleen.
Joe's little sister, Kathleen, nicknamed Kick, was one of his greatest admirers, having grown close with him while the two were living in Britain, aiding the war efforts.
In 1943, she volunteered with the Red Cross and fell in love with a British soldier. The only issue was he was a Protestant.
This is something Joe Sr. saw as a betrayal. She was not doing her duty as a daughter of this very prominent Catholic family.
Her family cuts her off.
Joe Jr. is the only Kennedy to attend Kic's controversial wedding just 3 months prior to his tragic accident. Merely 1 month later, as her newly wedded husband embarks on combat duty, he falls prey to a German sniper on the battlefield.
Imagine how Kathleen had felt, losing not only her closest brother, but her husband within 1 month.
No loss is great enough to diminish the Kennedys' disapproval of Kic's choices, especially when a few years later she becomes involved with yet another Protestant man named Peter Fitzwilliam. And the Kennedy curse strikes once more.
Kick and her fiancé at the time, Peter, board this small plane, and they are flying out of London and flying over to Paris. And somewhere along the way, the plane encounters some very bad weather, and it goes down. Both of them end up dying in this crash.
No one in the family goes to the funeral except her father.
They want to brush this under the rug because this is at a time when Joe Kennedy Sr. is placing JFK in line to run for president.
They were hoping that it wouldn't draw a whole lot of publicity.
All the while, Joseph was keeping another, much darker secret: the fate of another one of his daughters. Although most of Joseph's rigor was exacted on his sons, his daughters undoubtedly felt the burden of their family name as well. Rosemary is the first daughter and third child of the Kennedy household. Just after her birth in 1918, her earliest moments were marred by unfortunate circumstances.
Rosemary was trapped in the birth canal for 2 hours, which resulted in a loss of oxygen.
She suffered from a number of challenges, including mood swings and difficulties learning. She could be very erratic.
Rosemary bounces from school to school in her adolescence, presumably feeding the lack of stability in her life, and thus the ensuing outbursts of frustration. Behind closed doors, her parents insist on experimental injections in an attempt to balance her hormones. And when she reaches young adulthood, their greatest fear takes over.
Joe Kennedy was very concerned that his daughter's behavior could be taken advantage of by people that she might trust who didn't have her best interests at heart and certainly didn't have the family's best interests at heart.
He thought that something drastic had to be done.
Joe goes behind his wife's back and has Rosemary set up to have a frontal lobotomy. I just can't imagine what kind of person does that. Secretly have your daughter lobotomized so that she's no longer a problem.
In 1941, when Rosemary is just 23 years old, her father authorizes a lobotomy procedure to stifle her erratic behavior. While fully awake, the doctors ask Rosemary to recite "God Bless America" as they drill 2 holes into her skull and sever her brain tissue. Only is incoherent.
At this time, what was known was that the front of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, was involved in aggressive behavior. And so if you removed it, you would remove the aggression, but there wasn't much known about what else would happen. It's gone up through the areas that involve motor control, and that's well beyond the areas needed when it comes to emotional regulation.
After this procedure, Rosemary was permanently disabled, unable to speak or walk for the rest of her life.
When Rose sees her daughter after the procedure, it's too much for her to bear. Rosemary is sent to a health facility. She is essentially erased from the family, which is why she's known as the missing Kennedy.
It's 20 years before her siblings or other family members even find out that this has happened to her. She just sort of disappears.
The discovery emerges at the peak of one Kennedy's political prime.
The sad death of Joseph Jr. completely derails the plans of Joseph Sr. He now has to focus on the second son, John F. Kennedy. That is now where the future of the Kennedy clan lies.
John F. Kennedy has quick success ascending the political ladder under the guidance of his father. After 15 years of public service, he's inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States on January 20th, 1961. As the youngest and first ever Catholic President of America, he charms the nation with his progressive outlook and charismatic demeanor.
People wanted change, they wanted vigor, they wanted youth, and that seemed to be embodied by JFK.
And he had a captivating bride, Jacqueline Bouvier, daughter of an oil billionaire. With her grace, poise and intellect, Jackie brought a new aura of glamour to the White House.
John F. Kennedy's marriage to Jacqueline Bouvier made them look like the ultimate power couple. They were perfect, though a lot of the background stuff doesn't actually live up to that. John Kennedy appears to have had multiple and serial affairs with movie stars, including, of course, the famous affair with Marilyn Monroe.
In 1961, JFK nearly dies of an infection, and the source of this infection is reportedly a STD. Jackie Kennedy is well aware of what John is up to, but her mother-in-law, Rose, insists that Jackie must grin and bear it.
Out of the public eye, John's health and home life is desperately suffering. The situation takes a turn for the worse in 1963, when Jackie gives birth to their second son, Patrick. Born 5 weeks early, Patrick immediately shows signs of respiratory distress syndrome and is transferred to a children's hospital in Boston. He sadly perishes just 2 days later.
In November 1963, just 3 months after the death of his son, John books a multi-day tour in Texas. On November 22nd, the couple rides in an open-air motorcade through Dallas.
Weaving through Dealey Plaza amidst the loud cheers of supporters, JFK and Jackie smile and wave. Suddenly, a crack of gunfire pierces the air and in a split second strikes the president dead. The scene erupts in chaos before the suspected shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, is apprehended by police. Yet 2 days later, before his motive can be revealed in court, he too was shot by an enraged citizen, leaving the nation distraught and overwhelmed with unanswered questions.
The conspiracies that start to rise suggest that he didn't work alone. There were multiple shooters, the CIA might have been involved, Russia and Cuba might have been involved. None of these questions could now be answered, so the mind can run wild with what might have happened.
But for the Kennedy family, a much more sinister suspicion begins to haunt their legacy.
Robert Kennedy, known as Bobby, was the younger brother of JFK. Bobby served as the Attorney General whilst JFK was in office.
He was his closest advisor. They worked hand in hand. They were very, very close-knit. Following the death of his brother, he withdrew to deal with his grief.
As he wrestles with his despair, Jackie Kennedy gives Bobby a book about ancient Greek history and literature. He retreats to his room for hours on end, devouring the pages of Grecian perspectives on suffering and sin. From this, he finds a narrative that's all too familiar, the sagas of men plagued by the faults of their fathers.
The sins of the father carry on through the children, and they are somehow doomed by his behavior.
Some of his older siblings had already succumbed to the consequences, and now Bobby himself was next in line.
After the assassination of JFK, Bobby Kennedy resigns as Attorney General and pursues an election in the Senate. And it was in 1968 that he announces his candidacy to run for president of the United States.
But only months, he is shot dead in the kitchen of a Los Angeles hotel.
This is the second Kennedy assassinated within a 5-year period.
But the curse of the Kennedys isn't over yet, as another son of Joseph and Rose is about to find out.
My fellow citizens, I have requested this opportunity to talk to the people of Massachusetts about the tragedy which happened last Friday evening.
Not all Kennedys have been on the receiving end of death. Others have instigated it too.
On July 18, 1969, Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, the youngest child of the Kennedy clan, attends a party in Chappaquiddick, a small island off the coast of Massachusetts. On his drive home, he loses control of his 4-door Oldsmobile on the Dyke Bridge, plunging it nose first into the waters below.
Ted is able to set himself free, get to shore, and he flees the scene. But he wasn't the only person in the car.
Sat in the passenger seat is 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne, a campaign strategist who had attended the party. It's not until 10 hours after the crash that Ted notifies police, who are dispatched to recover her body.
This occurred when Kennedy was devising plans to run for the president. Did he panic, or was this some sort of cover-up?
This morning I entered a plea of guilty to the charge of leaving the scene of an accident.
However, the senator receives nothing more than a 2-month suspended sentence. Ted later issues a televised apology in which he publicly voices for the first time the blaming of an unknown force for the incident.
Whether some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys.
I think this is furious hand-waving. Look at us. Look at the curse and oh, poor me, all the tragedies in my life, rather than there's a dead young woman in a car underwater.
Although the last child of Joseph and Rose, Ted is not the last Kennedy to meet a treacherous fate. It seems the grandchildren are not immune.
We have other Kennedys that are dying from drug overdoses, car accidents. We then end up with JFK Jr. and his wife perishing in a plane crash. This curse has now affected them for the better part of 100 years.
Since the earliest days of the Kennedy dynasty, this is a family that has embodied the American dream, descendants of working-class immigrants who seemingly found success through family values and hard work.
Perhaps this is not so much about a generational curse, but rather about generational trauma, stemming from a patriarch who wants to exert prominence and power throughout all his offspring.
A man who's rumoured to have made his fortune out of bootlegging, rumoured to have been a Hitler sympathiser, who encouraged his children to be incredibly ambitious and to throw all caution to the wind. And we can see that over and over again with the Kennedys when they get themselves into these sometimes fatal situations. It's because they've behaved in a particularly reckless manner that the patriarch Joseph Kennedy instilled into them.
After a long day's work, a young chimney sweep enters the Busby Stoop Inn, a pub in North Yorkshire, England, to blow off some steam. He joins his friends who are huddled around a table in the dimly lit establishment, and after several rounds of ale, arrogantly decides to tempt fate by taking a seat in the pub's most infamous tall oak chair, which is said to have the most chilling reputation. Local legend says that a vindictive criminal once laid a curse against anyone who dared rest in its seat.
Some customers believe that they've seen the ghost of this criminal floating through the bar, and others laugh it off as some silly superstition. Still, there are a few that are brave or stupid enough to test this superstition.
For those who do perch in this chair, as the young chimney sweep will soon find out, a certain death awaits.
Why would someone curse a pub chair? And how evil must they have been for this curse to have actually worked?
In the small English village of Kirby Wisk, the crimes of one man once haunted the streets. The name Thomas Busby is known far and wide, not just for his cruel misdeeds, but for the parting gift that he left to the townsfolk.
We don't know exactly when Thomas Busby was born, but it was likely to be in the 1670s or the 1680s. Allegedly, he was a rather foul-mouthed drunk who engaged in petty crime to support his drinking habit. He also owned a small inn, and it was here that he spent most of his time drinking in one of his favourite oak chairs.
His inn was known to have a lot of fights, and a lot of those fights were instigated by Busby himself.
Busby's success as a thug is often thwarted by his reckless temper. As his pool of would-be victims learn to keep their distance, it's not until a fellow crook moves into town that Busby truly finds his footing in criminal activities. Daniel Orty is a seasoned counterfeiter who slithers into Kirby Wisk from Leeds around the year 1700. He purchases an isolated farmhouse away from the meddlesome neighbours in town, where he can secretly operate his illegal coin-clipping business.
Coin clipping was a very common crime in England in the 17th, 18th and even 19th centuries. Basically clipping coins and taking that precious metal, effectively stealing from the state. And it was punishable by death.
Captivated by Orty's meticulous scheme, Busby weasels his way into the lawbreaker's life and before long becomes his right-hand man. Their partnership flourishes, but amidst the influx of pound signs, something else is said to catch Busby's eye.
According to legend, Thomas Busby falls in love with Artie's daughter.
Audi, in the meantime, tries to cut that off and prevent anything from developing. According to the story, though, they secretly get married.
Not happy with his new son-in-law, vicious quarrels between Orty and Busby grow frequent until the tensions erupt in 1702. One sombre night, Mr. Orty finds his daughter alone at the inn and pleads with her to leave her violent husband. But before he gains traction, the drunken Busby returns home to find his bitter father-in-law sitting in his favourite oak chair.
We don't exactly know why this oak chair was so important to Busby, but certainly sitting in it was enough to evoke his rage.
Audi will confront Busby over this marriage and to try and take his daughter home. It escalates into a big argument.
Oddie is thrown out of Busby's inn and immediately returns home.
But Busby's anger towards his father-in-law is far from over, so he sought to finalise an end to their business relationship, written not by contract, but rather by blood. In the middle of the night, Busby, hammer in hand and consumed by fury, decides to pay a visit to his father-in-law. In an uncontrollable rage, he mercilessly bludgeons Orty to death and conceals his body in the forest behind his farmhouse.
The following day, the police find Artie's remains and hone in on their suspect. They find Busby, intoxicated, hunched over in his favourite chair. In 1702, Busby was found guilty of murdering his father-in-law, and he was sentenced to death by gibbeting.
Busby's fate was to be gibbeted. Now, what does that mean? It means that he was hanged until he was dead, and then his dead body was placed in an iron cage, and then that was hung up so that it was very much on public view. And this was a warning to other criminals: if you do what he did, this is what will happen.
This morbid visual reminder is not all to be left by Busby. As the legend says, on the day of his execution, with lively spectators gathered about, Busby makes one final request before reaching the noose.
Busby requests a hangman's meal or hangman's beverage, which is enjoying one ale one last time in his sacred chair. And before his parting, he is said to have uttered these final words.
Busby warns the townspeople, "Beware, for anyone who dares to sit in his favourite pub chair will fall prey to severe vengeance from beyond the grave."
Despite these warnings, the oak chair remains in the inn, which assumes the name the Busby Stoop Inn.
There's nothing to say that when that spirit leaves the body, that it doesn't go back to the place that he loves the most, which is his pub. And it's certainly not out of the realm of paranormal belief that this chair is indeed imbibing the spirit of Thomas Busby.
The eerie legend of the Busby Phantom attracts curious visitors from near and far. For those who take their thrills one step too far, however, risk rousing the wrath of the Busby curse. In 1894, the first inkling of said spell comes to light when a young chimney sweep sits in Thomas Busby's chair, daringly claiming the most condemned seat in the pub. He mocks the local myth and proceeds to journey home.
The man leaves the pub fully inebriated, and it's said that he passes out on the side of the street. However, the next morning, when everyone commences their daily activities, the young chimney sweep's body is seen hanging from a stoop.
The authorities aren't sure what to make of this, so they ruled the death a suicide.
It's later discovered a friend of his had followed him from the pub, robbed and then killed him, and then tried to make it look like he had taken his own life.
Could this have been the curse of Busby's chair come true?
The legend is cemented during World War II, when the Royal Air Force establishes the Skipton-on-Swale airfield, down the road from the Busby Stoop Inn.
According to the accounts, it became a risk-taking gesture for these men to want to sit in the chair.
But this light-hearted dare quickly falls out of fashion when the pilots who do sit in the chair fail to return home after the Second World War.
But not all are taken in battle. Some pilots are claimed by freak accidents right here in Kirby Wisk. In 1967, 2 Air Force aviators spend their evening laughing at the legend of the dead man's chair. And as one man rests upon its wooden seat, his fate is seemingly sealed.
The 2 men are driving back after their lark, and the car loses control and swerves into a tree and kills them both instantly.
In 1968, Tony Earnshaw, a local man with a disregard for superstition, takes ownership of the Busby Stoop Inn. He sees the rumours to be of little concern. In fact, if anything, they're good for business. That is, until he notices a sharp rise in creepy accounts of fatal accidents that befall those who sit in the oak relic.
Whilst a construction worker was on lunch, he took a seat in the chair. And when he went back to work, he fell from the roof. There are even accounts of cyclists and motorists leaving the pub and having a fatal accident.
One of the cleaning ladies, who herself was quite wary of the curse, accidentally rubs the chair and later dies of a brain malady.
He's starting to think, okay, I'm not believing this, but this is happening to people who are sitting in this chair. So is it just me, or is there really a curse?
The long string of disconcerting disasters eventually sways Mr. Earnshaw to lock the chair away in the inn's basement, ensuring no other customer would be put in harm's way. But in doing so, he makes one deadly mistake.
Mr. Earnshaw put the chair in a room that the delivery drivers regularly had access to.
One such delivery man stumbles upon the chair as he carries heavy barrels of ale from his truck to the basement, the perfect spot to take a quick rest. Unaware of the dangers upon him, he asks Earnshaw why such a fine piece of antique furniture is hidden away. Like so many before him, the delivery man makes it mere miles away when his van suddenly veers off the road in a lethal collision. The last victim to date of the dreaded dead man's chair.
In the 1970s, a local vicar declares that this chair is in fact evil, and that's enough for Mr. Earnshaw. He decides to take action and remove it.
Mr. Earnshaw donates the wicked oak chair to the local Thirsk Museum in 1978, where it can be preserved under one crucial condition.
Mr. Earnshaw requests that the chair is nailed high on the wall so that no one can actually sit in it.
If indeed the curse does exist, we have to ask ourselves, is it as pertinent today with the chair in the Thirsk Museum as it was when it was in Busby's Inn? It would really take a fool to find out.